Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special conversation sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society on a very special day. Today is President John Adams' 288th birthday, 288 years young. And of course, if you do not know, we have the Adams family papers here at the MHS. So a special happy birthday to him. My name is Kenneth Orrin Wall Street Channel. I am the Director of Research here at the MHS. I'd like to take a quick second to thank Olivia Saya, who's the Public Programs Coordinator, and Chris Kobney, our Chief Technology Officer, to make sure that everything is running smoothly for folks joining us online. In one of the great coincidences of history, the Dartmouth, one of the ships that was loaded with British East India Company tea, unbeknownst to its exporters, it would be on its way to a frigid death in Boston Harbor. It happened to be also transporting copies of poems on various subjects, religious and moral. A publication by Phillis Wheatley, the first enslaved person, the first African-American woman, and the third woman in Great Britain's North American colonies to publish a book of poetry. In this year, as we mark and consider the significance of the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, it is also fitting that we also examine the life and work of this exceptional poet, Phillis Wheatley, as well. The MHS is the first historical society in the nation, and we hold 14 million manuscript pages and also thousands of works of art and artifacts. Among them are the letters of Phillis Wheatley to her friend Ober Tanner, as well as Wheatley's writing desk, which is currently on display. So folks on Zoom, come join us and take a look. From the very beginning of its existence in 1791, the MHS has served as more than merely a repository for documents that chronicle the life of this new republic. It was also created as a place to host conversations, not just about the past, but also about the craft of writing about the past. And so, in that spirit, we have convened this panel of scholars from different humanities fields to discuss the extraordinary life of a remarkable woman. Our panelists will discuss their own work and also note that they have note how they have sought to introduce Wheatley to a 21st century audience. Each of our panelists will speak for approximately 10 minutes. We shall then have a couple of questions for them and then turn to you, our audience members, for more questions. If you are here in person, simply raise your hand. We'll come by with this microphone. And if you're joining us online, just type your questions into the Q&A box and Olivia will read them on your behalf. So let's get to the introductions. We're thrilled to have Dr. Tara Bynum, an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. She is the author of Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, of which one reviewer urged audiences to, quote, sit down, read this book, and become a changed reader, scholar, and human. This book exemplifies what humanities should be all about. Dr. Bynum's scholarship has been sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, among others, and she also discussed Phillis Wheatley in the MHS's own award-awaiting podcast, The Object of History. Dr. David Waldstreicher, distinguished professor of history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He is an historian of the early 19th century America. He's the author of multiple books, including Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution, and his most recent, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley. Both of these volumes are available downstairs. Ade Solanke is an award-winning British-Nigerian playwright and screenwriter, a Fulbright scholar, a senior lecturer at the University of Greenwich, a graduate of USC, whose new play, Phillis in London, has already won broad acclaim. Solanke tells of Wheatley's visit to London at the height of the slave trade and on the cusp of the American Revolution. First to Dr. Bynum.
Good evening. Let me first say that I have been thinking and talking about the Massachusetts Historical Society a lot recently. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to sit here in this space and to talk about Wheatley. Thanks, of course, to Olivia Canasorn, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the many who've helped make this event possible. And of course, thank you to my fellow panelists. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation. So why have I been thinking and talking a whole lot about the MHS? It's because I've been thinking about the letters between two friends, Phillis Wheatley and Uber Tanner. And more specifically, I've been thinking about why I or you can read them. And we can read them because they are here at the MHS, and the MHS has digitized them. So even if you're not here, I guess you can technically read them. Why are they here? Well, the provenance is what captures my attention, and it's my current curiosity. It's my entry into thinking about Wheatley and Tanner too. So despite what her 19th century biographer, Margaretta Odell, might say about Wheatley's poverty or what she doesn't have, when Phillis Wheatley dies in 1784 on a December Sunday, she leaves behind stuff, because I guess she can't take it with her. It's the kind of stuff, paper miscellanies in print and manuscript, to be expected from a writer. There are handwritten poems in a copybook. There are her signed books, her own poems on various subjects, and the books she read. She has letters too, even if the letters now belong to whom she wrote. That's not all of what's left. There's the stuff too that's harder for the 21st century researcher to see or find, because it's the stuff of mourning with a U. It seems grief makes a collector of the mourner. It's no different. It's no different for Wheatley. It's the grieving who carry, collect, and hold on to the deceased, in this case, Wheatley's stuff. What they carry with them, all kinds of stuff. It's what used to belong to the decedent, to the poet. It's personal. It might be material, or it might sit at the site of memory's burdens. Whatever it is, it's the stuff of memory, of remembering her. It's how she's remembered, or how her stuff is gathered, collected, and kept by persons looking to mourn or grieve her death and celebrate her life. And there are those who, in her own time, do the work of mourning and remembering her. And it's why I or you can read her stuff. Those who mourn the poet on a December day in 1784, her friends, acquaintances, lovers, or family, carry and safely store her letters, gather her books, and keep her in mind, even maybe especially so after she dies. What's left, her stuff, is gathered, collected, and organized by those who miss her or who want to celebrate her living. And her stuff makes it easier to keep hold on to her, and it gives value to her living. It makes her real again to the grieving. Their grief, their remembering, with Wheatley's stuff in tow, gives these material items their enduring value. Surely it helps that Wheatley is a noteworthy and best-selling writer. And it's true, too, and maybe easiest to miss, that her stuff has value because it proves to the grieving someone's life and just how gone, dead, past, or transitioned Wheatley as a friend, acquaintance, lover, or family is. So it starts as a mourning ritual, an announcement about a famous woman's death in countless newspapers. Seems to me is also how to make an archive, albeit not the only way. First, you've got to mourn a death. Second, collect the decedent stuff. Third, give it order or organize it in a meaningful way. And last, find a place to put it permanently. So this is the story of a woman's death, another woman's grief, and the archive or collection of stuff that is gathered in its wake. The deceased, of course, is Phillis Wheatley. The grieving woman is a friend of Wheatley, a woman whose name is Uber Tanner. Tanner is an enslaved at times woman too, and she lives in Newport, Rhode Island. They are likely about the same age, and their names, written in Wheatley's gracious cursive, are left behind to read or to say aloud by way of Tanner's collection of letters from Wheatley. Her letters, dated from 1772 to 1779, are addressed to Tanner by Wheatley. Of course, what's left extant, Tanner is Wheatley's most consistent interlocutor. And this is true because Tanner holds on to at least 8 letters from this collection, nearly 60 years. And because she keeps these letters, they prove just who Wheatley is to her. And she's a friend to her. Because Tanner can't forget her, Tanner's mourning, I would say, has her collect, keep, and carry her friend's stuff. Tanner keeps the stuff with her friend's name on it. And her stuff has value because of Tanner's assessment of it. She collects those items that demonstrate their friendship and Wheatley's celebrity. And her collection of stuff not only proves who she is to Wheatley and who Wheatley is to her, The resulting archive, to borrow a definition from archivist Dorothy Berry, are the materials, permanent records collected or created by an individual or organization because of the enduring value contained in the information they contain. Tanner has created or collected these materials from her friend because of their lasting value to her. It's a value based on who she is to Wheatley and what she knows of her deceased friend and her friend's fame. Hers is not a public memorial in the way of mortuary notices. It fits who they are to each other, friends. And what Tanner keeps is the stuff that can remember to her just who she lost on a December day in 1784 and where she might find her. I know of her collecting habits because her collection's origin story is gathered in a footnote found in the Proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I spent much of today on a hunt to find so much more about this footnote. The footnote is an excerpt of a letter not from Tanner or Wheatley, but from Catherine East Beecher to her nephew-in-law, Reverend Edward Hale, pastor of South Congregational Church in Boston. If Beecher sounds familiar, it's because this is Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister-in-law, not her sister. This is Catherine with a K. So for those of you who know the Beecher family tree very well, it's not Catherine with a C, it's Catherine with a K. It's William Beecher's wife. In her October 23rd, 1863 letter to Hale, Beecher explains the little she can remember about Tanner and her collection of Wheatley-related stuff. Beecher doesn't know Wheatley. The poet dies, I think, before Beecher is born, though Beecher's birthday is not entirely clear. But Beecher can and does speak on Beecher's relationship to Tanner. She meets Tanner as a 20-something white woman when her husband serves as pastor of First Congregational Church in Newport, Rhode Island. It's Tanner's church. Tanner's a well-established member, baptized on a summer day in 1768. For nearly 70 years, this church, at one time pastored by the revered Reverend Samuel Hopkins, has served as a witness to her life in Newport. It's her place of worship. It's a meeting place, a place to gather or collect what she can remember. The church is a kind of site or a records keeper of her memories. Tanner is named in its record books list of marriages, baptisms, book subscribers, and deaths too. It's where she gets married to a man named Barry Collins in 1790. It's where she buys her pastor's book to help fundraise for missionary efforts at Sierra Leone in 1793. She trusts this church to remember her and to keep her, and Beecher is the wife of her pastor as part of this church. By way of her affiliation, Beecher earns Tanner's trust, and Tanner trusts Beecher to keep some of her letters, a bit of her stuff, and that of her long-gone friend, even if she's certain that the younger woman, that's Beecher, can never know Wheatley the way that she, Tanner, does. Before Tanner's death in 1835, she gives her letters to Catherine East Beecher. She shares with the young woman 7 years' worth of correspondence from 1772 to 1779 from Wheatley to Tanner, because there's no extant correspondence that I know of from Tanner to Wheatley. She gives a bit of it over these letters to Beecher, and Beecher's letter to Hale narrates as best as she can what Tanner and Wheatley mean to each other and what Tanner means to her. And it's ultimately why we can read them today. Thank you.
I'm going to try to talk about some of my strategies for bringing Wheatley to life in the context of the way it's been done for more than 100 years. It might seem to be a rather difficult thing to do because Phillis Wheatley left homes, more than a dozen letters, but not the usual archive, not as much stuff as biographers usually use to construct a life. And perhaps that's one reason why there are now 2 scholarly biographies, but there have been many plays and several in that are new or in development, and a lot of young adult fiction, which became obvious to me, having a daughter who grew up while I was writing my book, and also just kind of being interested in print culture, that's actually where most of the people who know about Wheatley find out about her, is from the many young adult books that are based on, that are often based on each other, that have some relationship to the archive that we have, but are often fictionalized. So there's a long tradition of trying to bring Phillis Wheatley to life, and a long appreciation that there's a lot of drama in that life. And what I want to talk about today is, I could easily talk about the strategies I used and that's what I thought I was going to do, to talk about the strategies I used to try to tell a dramatic and true story of her life. But I actually want to lean in on the drama and reflect a bit on two dramatic scenes that convinced me that there might be different ways of telling her story in relation to the best known scene of her life, which is the so-called trial of Phillis Wheatley, that Henry Louis Gates emphasized in several versions of a lecture that he gave over the years, culminating in his Jefferson lecture that was published as a little book called The Trials of Phillis Wheatley, and which for several years was actually started to be cited as the biography of Phillis Wheatley before Vin Coretta's extensive and well-researched biography.
Schools,
For
junior high schools,
Gates, the trial of Phillis Wheatley is the scene where she gets called in to and examined by the Boston worthies who signed the attestation that appears in the frontispiece of her book. And he says, let us imagine the scene of her being actually questioned. And he imagines the kind of questions that she may have been asked to demonstrate that she had actually written the poems. What this gets right about the attestation is the purpose of the attestation that these eminent men signed, ministers, lawyers, judges, was that they were saying, yes, she wrote, we have witnessed that she is who she says she is, who the Wheatley says she is, that she wrote these poems that are now being published in London. That scene never happened, and Gates kind of admits it by saying, let us imagine, right? But it's so often taken as an actual event, and so what he actually names as the primal scene of African-American literature has been run with and very often repeated as something that really happened. And actually, he takes the scene from a wonderful young adult biography novel, well-researched, by Shirley Graham, published in 1948, The Story of Phillis Wheatley, that actually started out as a radio play, as a drama in the late 30s. My former classmate, Barbara Savage, actually found the transcript of the radio play and talks about it in her book about African Americans and radio in that period. So it actually migrated from drama to historical fact in our time because it was so compelling and because it dramatized her life. The problem is not just that it never actually happened, because it didn't need to happen, because all these guys who signed this attestation, which was an artifact of print culture, and it's supposed to travel to London for a London audience who couldn't actually see her, because these men had all seen her. They all knew her. She'd written poems about their relatives. She'd been in their parlors. They signed it, this piece of paper that then shows up in the frontispiece of the book, because Phillis and the manuscript were traveling. They didn't need to examine her because they knew very well that she had written poems. The problem with this primal scene of them examining her is that it puts the emphasis on the suspicion that she wasn't already famous. I mean, which she was. After the Whitfield poem, several years before, she was famous in Anglo-America. She didn't need to be examined, only for people in London who didn't know about her, that there needed to be an attestation. But it makes her younger and more vulnerable than she was in 1773. And it may have its uses as a symbol of the dilemma of the Black writer in a world where whites control the printing press and publication strategies. And so I don't want to deny that those are valid meanings and have a meaning that and an interest that's larger than Wheatley. And Gates then does interesting things with that. The problem is that it doesn't actually accurately tell the story of what was going on with Wheatley between 1770 and 1773, or even her trajectory and her experience of actually dramatically constructing scenes that changed her own life by turning her poems into actions. So I want to briefly talk about the two scenes that I used in my book to set that up and to make it clear just how much, if we must say, agency she had in the process of making her own career. The first, which is what I open with, is the first poem she publishes, which is about a shipwreck of these two Nantucket merchants, Hussey and Coffin, in 1767. And in the newspaper, it's published in the Newport newspaper, it's prefaced as saying that she was waiting table and heard the story and then wrote this poem, which is about how, which wonders what these merchants were thinking as they faced possible death and how they thought about their relationship to the Almighty and to Scripture at that moment. But then it turns, and I have to shorthand this because I want to keep on time, and calls attention to her own role telling the story. So she uses this scene where she's just overhearing it and a servant, and makes her and by the time she gets to the end of the poem, she is commenting on and riffing on this question of the relationship of pious people and the people who elegize them, or fortunately in this instance they didn't die, so she's not elegizing them. She's telling the story about their vulnerability before fate, nature, and God, and turns it into a kind of a morality tale, a pious exercise, but also a story about what poems can do and how they can connect audiences. And it's a little sermon. She puts herself into a position of authority, and then it gets published in the Newport newspaper. And this launches her as someone who is known extra locally and whose poems are in demand. Fast forward as quickly as I can, 5 years, to her poem To His Excellency Lord Dartmouth, which is the poem that is going to get her to England. And the story there that gets told by Thomas Woolridge is that he went to see this renowned Boston figure. He's actually a colonial official in Florida, but he's someone who's from the same province as Lord Dartmouth. He knows him very well, and he's looking for Lord Dartmouth's further patronage at the time. And he writes to Lord Dartmouth that I went to see this well-known person, and he intimates that he was skeptical, and he asks her to write a poem. And she says, oh, okay, you can suggest the subject. And he says, well, I suggested writing a poem to Lord Dartmouth, who's just been appointed Under Secretary of State for the Colonies. And she says, oh, okay, come back in the morning. And he comes back, he says, in the next day, and she has this amazing 50-line poem that demonstrates that either she's such a genius, she can write this polished poem overnight. But what I actually think is that she's had this in her pocket. She's been working on this. She knows exactly who Lord Dartmouth is. She knows that he is a Methodist who's sympathetic to the colonies and also to the projects of converting the natives and maybe to anti-slavery reform. And that New Englanders are very excited that he's been reappointed to this powerful position. And this praise poem is famous. It's not as famous as it should be for the way she expertly performs New England patriot politics at the moment, but it's more famous for being one of the poems in which she introduces the question of her own position vis-a-vis the patriot movement, and talks about how she can sympathize with the plight of the protesting colonists because she knows what it is that she and her father know what it is to have their liberty taken away and to be in. So she knows that this comparison of how the Patriots are being treated to slavery is being made, and then she does her own turn on it. And this becomes one of the events that sets up her going to London, going to see Lord Dartmouth, and getting her poem published. These are two dramatic scenes that other people tell the story of. We don't have Wheatley's version of it outside the poem, but what the poems make very clear, and the larger trajectory makes clear, is that she sets them up. She makes these scenes dramatic. She turns her poems into actions that change her life, and that make her not just famous as this kind of exotic first, but as someone who is making connections between religion, politics, and the lives of her fellow Africans in Boston and in the whole Atlantic world. And that's why her story is, her life is so dramatic. And that's why ultimately I was able to tell it as a story that while I did a lot of research, I can tell a lot of context and spin a story about the coming of the revolution in Wheatley. But really it's a story about how she made her poems actions as well as art that changed her life, as well as the controversy over slavery and the revolution.
Thank you both. It's actually an honor and a pleasure to be with academics and scholars whose work has fed into my own as a creative writer, in discussing how we respectively bring Phillis to life. I also want to quickly thank Peter Drummy and Gavin Kipsey for, I think 6 months ago, taking the time. They gave me an hour and spent probably 2 hours here showing me around this very room and other parts of the building. And I did see Phillis's desk. And all those things, being close to places and objects connected with her story, have really, well, yes, brought her to life in terms of my research. Phillis referred to her friends in London in one of the letters I think David was just referring to. Again, very briefly, I'd like to say just how grateful I am to my friends in Boston and in America generally for their real kindness during my Fulbright research trip last year. The teams at Meet Boston, Old South Church, Nancy Taylor was a very kind host for me one day over at the church, Emerson College, and historical organizations here in Boston, as well as, I have to say, amazing number of contemporary Boston artists who embraced me and really helped me understand Phillis as local artists and as American artists in a way that, as someone from across the pond, I probably wouldn't have done without their insights. But even though I'm from overseas, I have a personal interest in how events of 250 years ago relate to my life and experiences today. I'm African, obviously, and both my parents are West African from Nigeria. And we have our own, as you know, Independence Days. Many of my friends from the Caribbean in England celebrate Independence Days. So we do lean into this notion of anti-colonial struggle, as you can imagine, in a very real way. And we are, as you are, very engaged in the process of dealing with repairing the damage done by slavery. So my Phillis project is about Phillis Wheatley, but it's also really about a more general question, which is how do we remember, reimagine, and bring to life the lives of enslaved people who lived through, endured, survived these very horrific moments in human history, but in her case in particular brought beauty in the midst of it. So my contribution to this work of reimagining is as a playwright. And I've actually spent now almost 10 years working on this project. And I often wonder, well, I can tell you, when I first started, I didn't think it would take as much time or engage me and obsess, actually, become so engaged in this whole world. And apart from being here at Emerson, I've been working on a couple of other characters, including Obatana. You know enough about Phillis. I won't repeat some of the material that's already been shared. In particular, obviously, my connection was because of her coming to London. I'm a born and bred Londoner from Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, West London. Some of you may know the Notting Hill Carnival. So I grew up in a very political, I suppose, black space, African British history, often focuses on certain regions in London. Notting Hill, Brixton are two of the most famous. And I come from London. I came here rather from London, first of all, as a writer when I was first on a project in Los Angeles. So the very first way in which I connected with Phillis was as an African woman writer abroad. That's what I was. That's what she was. But apart from that, as a British Nigerian, there are so many other ways in which her story compels me. But it's something that I realize for many people, it's a question mark. It's a question they have. And I got used to very quizzical gazes when I would first say, I'm here researching Phillis Wheatley. And it's something over the last few years doing not just readings of my play in Gambia, in Ghana, here in America, in the Caribbean. I've often come across people who do question, why am I so engaged? Why is Phillis so important? Well, there are a number of reasons why I think it's really important to bring her story to life. I'm interested first and foremost in great stories well told. And those great stories require first and foremost a powerful central character, someone facing a really gripping situation, a situation that arouses very strong conflicts that emotional audiences will engage with emotionally. And her story has all of these in abundance. I've got a personal affinity, as I said. I was once an African woman writer abroad. And one of my enduring memories is just the way in which being in a new environment invigorated my writing, gave me new material to draw on. And so I can, if you like, graft her story onto my story and imagine how London influenced her, transformed her. Beyond her own individual story, I actually also believe, and this is partly why I'm motivated to work in this field, stories centering African women are important in and of themselves. And I think through stories as a human family, this is the way in which we begin to empathize and understand and relate to each other. And these figures are protagonists, African women protagonists are still very rare in lots of, on the stage and on the screen. And so my contribution is also to increase the visibility of Black women by providing compelling female protagonists as Phillis is. I want to share the richness and originality and genius of their contribution to human expression. So she's an engaging figure in the way that strong central dramatic characters tend to be. The struggles and difficulties she went through, not only as an enslaved woman, but having endured the arduous middle passage. And not only that, experiencing this trauma as a 7-year-old child, same age as any second grader you perhaps know. So my question as a dramatist, well, how did she find the mental strength and fortitude to write? It's bad enough, hard enough, without all of that trauma. And then to write poetry, which is, again, a form which has very specific difficulties. So her story is an opportunity to bring to life the story of an artist persisting, which we all do, but in her case, succeeding in spite of incredibly tremendous odds. For me, her story is also a way to bring to life the African diaspora. She, of course, connects to all three parts of what we call the Black Atlantic. Born in Africa, trafficked to the Americas, and then visited as an honored and celebrated visitor to London, visited London. In lots of ways, I think of hers as being, if you like, the ultimate diaspora story. And my project, Explorer Stories, is really about exploring the diaspora. She touches all parts of the Black Atlantic. And that's something I wanted to explore. And in fact, in my other work, I've explored my experience as a British-born African when I returned to Nigeria. And I'm seen as English. That's an interesting contradiction we wrestle with. But then to imagine her in the middle of the British Empire, the high street, London, the high street of the British Empire at that point in history, and all the peoples from different parts of Africa she would have encountered. And not just that, the people from China who were involved in the East India Tea Company production process, people from India. She would have come into a really cosmopolitan, vibrant, strange to her, obviously, place. She visited Sadler's Wells Theatre. There was no theatrical theatre productions in Boston at the time. She went to Cox's Museum, which is just minutes from where the British Council is now based, near Charing Cross. I was there a few weeks ago. I was actually at Benjamin Franklin House doing a film of an extract from the play. And I thought, oh, she was just round the corner. So there are lots of ways in which I've retraced her footsteps. Cox's exhibition was a fantastical display of all sorts of curios and curiosities. So she came into a really, for her, I imagine, amazing space. So all of those experiences, again, I reverse with my own experience of being in LA 20 odd years ago. And I graft, again, my experience onto hers. So the play is a theatrical experience, but it's also part of a larger public engagement project where I've worked with school groups and with community groups and all sorts of other organizations. We did a talk just last week at the British Library, which has actually an original copy of her poetry. I was at St Andrews University in Scotland on Thursday, and they have an original copy which was deposited there, I think, as soon as the book was published, because it was one of the official libraries of copyright, I think they were called. We had a wonderful display and discussion last week. In fact, in all the years it's been there, apparently it's only been taken out once in 250 years. So we were laughing about and wondering who was this young scholar, Scottish scholar, who was tempted to take out her book. So yeah, the story connects to me for all those reasons, but because ultimately England is so inextricably bound up in the transatlantic slave trade, as you know, and that connects to me as somebody who's a contemporary African Briton. Many of the people who benefited from the parliamentary compensation program of, I think, I can't remember the exact date, 1833, I think it was. Most of those people were English aristocrats, English merchants, as they're often called, who were involved in slavery in the Caribbean. Not one penny went to the actual enslaved. This is an issue you can imagine we are very exercised about, and we're still working towards reparations. And I think this story will contribute to a sense that reparations isn't just about a general theme. It's about individuals who live their lives in and through a period of history which led to so much pain and suffering. But as well as that, through someone like Phillis, we can see the fortitude, the resilience, and the courage that many people face that fate with. And I often hear people say, well, we've had so many slavery stories, we've had too many. And I totally disagree, as you can imagine. Alongside the play about London, I've written a play about her time in Boston, which is opening this week. You're all invited, naturally. And the play about Boston actually grew out of my research here over the last year. And it's really to look at some of the relationships that Tara was talking about, the world that she came to London from, and obviously to explore the drama of her books being involved. I didn't realize this until I got here. Her books being involved in the Tea Party story, having been on board the Dartmouth. So the play is looking at the couple of days after the 28th of November when the ship pulled into, I think, Griffith's Wharf, or maybe one of the others, and then it emerged at Griffith's Wharf, and how she and her friends strategized and succeeded in rescuing her books from a hold which, along the lines of which she had been transported here from Africa to America. I think she's a living testament to the spirit of freedom and liberty. So as you think and we think about this anniversary of the Boston Tea Party leading up into the revolution, I think she is at the heart of that story, not only writing about many of the plot points, if you like, along the way, but also a testimony to the fact that people will fight for their freedom. And as Toni Morrison said, in spite of a literate slave, Toni Morrison said, a literate slave was supposed to be a contradiction in terms. Her story, with all the contradictions, being a prodigy, being a poet, being a celebrity, and being enslaved, for me is just the ingredients for an amazing drama. And I hope you'll come to see at least one of the plays. You're welcome to come to London too.
Thank you very much to our presenters. We have a few minutes here for some questions, and we'll open this up to our audience as well, both here and online. I'm going to start with Tara and also David. You're welcome to jump in on this. But Tara, during your interview with us, talking about Phillis Wheatley, you said something that I don't think many biographers would necessarily say, and you said something about how privacy was important. Do we really need to know every aspect, everything about her life? Is there any sense of privacy for someone who is an historical figure? And I was wondering if you would elaborate on that, and David will get your impressions on this too.
This is a thing that I have been wrestling with, in large part because, when it comes to thinking of Black women historically, and certainly in the 18th century, there's a real kind of, I think, in scholarly conversation, a sense of what's not there. And I have increasingly started to wonder if what's not there at times is very intentional. And I have also wondered how much is actually my business to know. And so, I think that I very much am someone who kind of delights in doing this research. I want to know all the things. And yet I also know that there will inevitably be some walls that I come up against that aren't just about kind of the power of the archive or the power of the special collections library. But it also is the power of the individual person to say, you can't know that. So I think about kind of the letters that Uber Tanner gives to Catherine Eads Beecher. It's her pastor's wife. So do you think that her pastor's wife got all the letters? Should I assume that there are only 8 letters out there because that's what there are, in existence today? Or is it the case, and it actually is, that, there are letters that Wheatley refers to as, kind of not making it to Tanner, or, letters that get lost somehow. So at the very least, I know that there were more than 8 letters by way of what has gotten lost. And, I just think in very sort of practical and human terms, like there are 20-something women who are friends and corresponding about all sorts of things. So as an 80 or 90-year-old making a choice right before she dies, like, does Tanner give the whole set, the whole run of letters to Catherine Beecher? She might pick and choose. And I think in that way, yes, privacy is important. And it's important for me to think about, even as I also want to know all the things.
David, any thoughts?
We rightly lament that we don't have Wheatley's second book, which was referred to as a manuscript that actually existed, and that she may have tried to get published, and that John Peters tried to get published after her decease. But the list of poems that she tried to get published makes very clear is that there are specific poems that she had written and that she was holding for that book. But I think she also was publishing poems anonymously, like women did. Most women who published poems and novels and anything in the 18th century published anonymously. It's true that she was famous. It's true that she was being invited to produce poems and that she had opportunities to do that. But so I found some poems in newspapers and in some of the short-lived magazines of the time that I think that there's a good chance she wrote. And I found enough of them to feel confident in saying that she probably didn't write every one that I am proposing, that I have in the appendix of the book and that I talk about, and that I've talked about in an article in the journal Early American Literature. But she probably wrote some of them, and they're probably, but maybe more importantly is how many we don't know about and that we've never looked for. But I mean, I think the larger issue for me, maybe it's because I'm a historian and I'm not obsessed with the canon of Wheatley as much as there's a larger point here, which is that we only know the things that the archive has allowed us to know, and that is structured by so many things, including oppression and discrimination. But she's very conscious of everything she does, and she knows her audiences. We also only know, as with any famous person and writer, what she wanted us to know. And that's true about her writing, and that's true about her life. And so I've tried to call attention to those moments where we can see her very aware of what she's revealing and what she's withholding. And one example that I feel like I came to appreciate really very late in the process was that we don't really know the story of her emancipation because she says different things about it to different people. And I actually think that managing that very carefully and withholding information about it was actually part of the process that made it happen. And it teaches us something about what folks like Phillis Wheatley were up against and how the story of how some of them became free or tried to is not just about them claiming freedom and making statements. It's also about them withholding information and being very, very careful. And that has to be part of the story too. And talking about the archive and its limits doesn't quite capture that.
Thank you very much. One for you, Ade, on a similar theme. Just last Thursday, we had a panel here of biographers talking about the craft of biography and writing. And one of them was a journalist who said that she had a difficult time putting aside taking off her journalist cap to write because she wanted all these sources are there before she put anything on paper. You are a former journalist. You worked for the BBC Radio 4, The Guardian, and now you're a playwright and a scriptwriter. How have you made this transition?
So I always think of journalism as the literature of fact. So in every story, there's selection, there's choice, there's inclusion, exclusion. So it may feel or it may seem that these are two very diametrically opposed worlds. In actual fact, it's not the case. However, having said that, because I did have the rigors of fact drilled into me, it's important to me as a playwright that I stick as far as I can to the known information. But when I say there's no such thing as a true story, as soon as you begin to organize material and highlight some things and emphasize others, you're making judgments which will inevitably distort. Distort is another word for shaping. It's the same basic thing. I didn't want to, in my particular, just as my own approach, given how often African stories are misrepresented, it was for me important not to do anything that was, how can I put it, just too fanciful. But it is also my job as a playwright to invent. That's what it says on the tin. That's the job description. So yes, I have lots of things in both the plays, the Boston one and the London one, where I've made stuff up. I've put her into scenes with people she didn't meet. Sancho, Ignatius Sancho, being one of them, who I'm just so in love with. I just put him everywhere these days. But he actually wrote about her. And it was partly his emotion, the emotion with which he wrote about her that moved me. He chastised the Wheatleys, got her parading around London, and you've not freed her. And the feeling and the passion with which he wrote about her made me imagine how he'd be if he met her. She'd be his daughter. He was writing about her as though it were one of his own. I think he had 7 or 8 children. So that emotion was there, and I can then construct a relationship between them based on that feeling. I had her go to places she didn't visit in England just because I knew interesting people would be there. She didn't really meet many of the Bluestockings, but as a woman writer, I'm interested in the Bluestockings, the Hester Thrales and the Elizabeth Montagues and all of the women who were around that period it always makes me smile when I say this, but they were creating spaces where men and women could converse as equals. That was where they were at. So as a journalist, I still have the sense of the fidelity to fact, but as a creative writer, I do need, and I give myself permission to invent, but I don't want to go too far. If she, for example, Equiano, who's another famous African Georgian, was somewhere in the South Pole on an expedition. He wasn't in London, although he was based in London. He wasn't there. Sancho was in London at the time, so I can plausibly put them into relationship. That was the rule I gave myself. Anyone who was actually there. William Wilberforce, for example, was the nephew of John Thornton, who hosted Phillis in Clapham during the stay. Now, William Wilberforce often came to visit his uncle in London. Now, I don't know if he was there that actual summer, but he could have been there. And William Wilberforce, being such an important figure in the history of the abolition of slavery in England, one of the white abolitionists, it's interesting to imagine her meeting this young. He would have been 14 years old, so you can imagine how. And having read her poem about Harvard, I know she had a sense of learning and its importance for young people. And John Thornton had a couple of other children who would have been around, so I imagined her relating to them and how she would relate to them.
Thank you very much. We're happy to take questions now from the audience here as well as online. Any questions? All right, Jerry.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had any insights into what drew Phillis to poetry, because there's lots of creative people. There were a number of ways in which she could, exploit her creativity. Was she exposed to it when she was in the Wheatley household, or does anybody have any insights into that?
I think that's really interesting. She came from a part of West Africa which had a strong poetic tradition. Senegal, Gambia area. I know some people say sometimes, she may have come from Ghana, but definitely the tradition of the elegy was well developed in I think it's called the Tuba region. Don't quote me on that, but there certainly was a tradition of literature, and African literature is often oral literature, but alongside the orature, there was a literary tradition there that she may have tapped into as a young child. And I always say, people disagree, but I think if she was a genius in America, she was certainly a genius in Africa. It didn't just descend when she arrived. So she was probably involved in, reading and writing at a very young age, even there. Again, no proof, but that's my supposition.
Online? All right, we'll come back to you, Laura.
So S. Robbins asks, why do you think she's been so appealing to authors who write for young people and not just recently?
I think it's part of a long tradition of kids' books and young adult books that center on celebrity, famous people of achievement when they were young. And these were the books I read when I was a kid. So she's particularly fascinating because she's already doing the thing that makes her famous, and she's still young. So she's a natural for that kind of treatment. And I think what I know about these books is, as a reader of them as a kid, as well as a reader of them then for some of my own children, I started to notice that it actually helps when you don't know that much. They're more imaginative for people like Thomas Jefferson, whose childhood we don't know much about, because then the author of the biography or fictional treatment can kind of run with the facts that do exist. And it's really interesting to read the range of things you see in these young adult books. But I have a very positive take on it, not just because it's gotten people interested in Phillis Wheatley, but because these books exist in a tradition of appreciating the power of literacy and the excitements that it can hold for young readers, and specifically the way that Black women handed down an appreciation of how amazing what she did was, even when Black male critics, as Gates talks about in the Trials of Phillis Wheatley, started to be skeptical of Phillis Wheatley because she seemed like she wasn't Africanist enough or political enough. I argue against that, but that was when writers like James Weldon Johnson and W.B. Du Bois, but then he changed his mind about it later, perhaps because of Shirley Graham, who he eventually married. And then in the 60s, the Black arts movement were skeptical. And I know one playwright who's actually writing a play that centers in part around that debate between the women and the men in the 60s and 70s about whether Wheatley was a usable past or whether she needed to be put behind. There's a lot at stake, and I think that there's a kind of even the kids' books that are very short thematize that sense that there's those scenes of Phillis learning how to read and write and then impressing people and then making friends with that. There's something very powerful about that speaks to a lot of people's experience and hopes and dreams.
I got into the habit of asking people in the Boston area when I was here last year, what did you learn about Phillis at school? And a lot of people, I'm in my 50s, of my age, would say, oh yeah, we learned about her in school and it was inspiring, because as a teenager, you think, what can we do? You don't really have much agency. And, it was for them a story of someone who just achieved in spite of incredible odds. And just a few months ago, I was at a school in Roxbury, and the young people there were saying the same. It's inspiring. So I think, there's an obvious reason why young adult fiction or writers are focusing on her. She does inspire.
I'm intrigued, Ade, when you're writing a play about a historical figure like this, whose archive contains both a very carefully crafted public voice in Wheatley's poetry and then this very personal private voice in her letters to her friend, how do you distill that into the voice with which the character will speak in your play?
That's a very good question. So I always say I'm writing for now, about then for now. So, for example, I call it antique, the language. The play is they speak very naturally, I would say. So I'm more interested in the relationships and the dynamics of, any playwright is interested in interpersonal. And you've got the big epic story of, the Boston Tea Party or surviving the Middle Passage around all of that. But the drama is in the lives that you're depicting in relationship with each other. And so it's a matter of just distilling the essence of what's in the poem, extracting what you can use, for drama, for the action, as David was saying, repurposing the material, really. There are some bits where I've quoted her verbatim when she talks about being torn from her father's breast. It moves me to tears every time I read it. So why would you not include that powerful personal testimony? But at the same time, as I say, some of the language is obviously antique, so that wouldn't really play well on stage. So I've modernized it, I suppose. But again, not distorted the sentiments. Does that answer the question?
So on behalf of the Massachusetts Historical Society, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and thank our panelists for joining us to talk about this remarkable figure.